Well, the United States is involved in a very large military buildup in the Southern Caribbean. Something like 10% of the US Navy's deployed assets are currently in the SOUTHCOM area of responsibility. This is not something that the region is accustomed to seeing. Normally, the United States has a much lighter military footprint in this region.
President Trump, if cartels are now going to be seen as foreign terror organizations, would you think about ordering U.S. Special Forces into Mexico to take them out?
Could happen. Stranger things have happened.
I think this is happening now for a number of reasons. First, the Trump administration is very keen to demonstrate that they are implementing a new paradigm when it comes to dealing with counter narcotics. No longer is the US Coast Guard the lead operator in these missions, but the US Navy and the US Air Force have been brought in to support and in many ways take over these missions. And I think that that new paradigm is there because the administration is keen to show that foreign terrorist organization designations for cartels in Latin America have consequences, in this case, lethal consequences. This is not just rhetoric, but it is indicative of a new operating model which sees the US Navy and the US Air Force in the lead and the US Coast Guard no longer. Second, I think the administration understands that Maduro himself and his regime is implicated in these kinds of activities.
And a lot of the Venezuelan drugs come in through the sea, so you get to see that. But we're going to stop them by land also.
He is one of the largest narco traffickers in the world and a threat to our national security. Therefore, we've doubled his reward to $50 million. Under President Trump's leadership, Maduro will not escape justice and he will be held accountable for his despicable crimes.
Nuestra diplomacia no es la diplomacia de las cañoneras, de las amenazas, porque el mundo no puede ser el mundo otra vez de hace 100 años. La diplomacia de las cañoneras. Tengo tantos cañones, tantos barcos y te los pongo al frente. Y tú te rindes. O haces lo que a mí me da la gana que tú hagas. No, eso se acabó. Se acabó.
Well, the Maduro regime has responded by mobilizing, or what they think is mobilizing, citizen militias. We have significant doubts about whether these militias would actually fight in an invasion type scenario. But they've nevertheless responded by showing videos of mobilizations in major urban centers. They've been very public about where they've placed their aerial defense systems. They've shown lots of videos of the Venezuelan armed forces preparing for conflict. They've also called upon the region to more forcefully denounce the deployment of US forces. Notably, the region has been quite silent in its criticism of the US. In fact, many countries have been supportive of the deployment in the Southern Caribbean. A number of countries have also declared Venezuelan cartels to be foreign terrorist organizations, which looks to Washington as if the region is actually in favor of the pressure campaign against Maduro as opposed to lending him any kind of diplomatic credibility. I don't think full-scale invasion in this case is, I think it's unlikely to happen for two reasons. First, it doesn't fit with President Trump's modus operandi. President Trump forswore long-term, open-ended engagements with boots on the ground, going all the way back to his 2016 campaign, and I don't think it's in his modus operandi today either. It should also be noted that it doesn't fit the pattern of the deployment. Although the deployment has been very large, it hasn't featured a number of potential ground forces. Right now in the region, we have about 10,000 troops, at least publicly identified 10,000 troops. That's not nearly enough to engage in any kind of invasion of Venezuelan territory.
14 semanas de amenaza, que los gringos, que tienen 15 barcos, que tienen 2.600 misiles, que tienen 100 aviones, que ahora viene el avión más grande, perdón, ¿cómo se llama? El portaaviones más grande del mundo llamado General Ford. Que los gringos hagan lo que les dé la gana. Nosotros somos imperturbables y nadie nos va a sacar del camino de producir, trabajar, construir, de la democracia directa y verdadera y de la paz perpetua, bendecida y sagrada de Venezuela.
There are reports that you are considering strikes within Venezuela. Is that true?
No.
That you made a decision on that?
No, it's not true.
Well, I see three or four different distinct scenarios here. One is that Maduro decides he doesn't want to remain in office or that the pressure is too high. He would rather leave of his own volition. I think that's the best scenario for everyone. After all, he was defeated last year in elections. He remained in office despite the vote tallies clearly showing that by 2-1 or more, the Venezuelan people chose against him.
Would you like to see regime change in Venezuela?
Well, we're not talking about that, but we are talking about the fact that you had an election which was a very strange election, to put it mildly. I'm being very nice when I say that.
El primer votante quedó bien marcado.
Another potential scenario is if the US does start hitting land-based targets in Venezuela, you could have the Venezuelan armed forces decide that they will act in the interest of self-preservation and that their future is not with Maduro, that their future is actually with the democratic transition, that they've never been, the Venezuelan armed forces, it should be noted, the modern Venezuelan armed forces have never been in conflict before. So the context changes dramatically if the US begins to hit land-based targets in Venezuela. They've never experienced anything like that before, and they may well decide that their interests, their future, lies with someone other than Nicolas Maduro. And in that scenario, they could deliver Maduro to justice. They could kill or capture him. They could try to seize power themselves. They could stand on the side of a democratic transition. That could play out in a number of ways.
Aquí arriba, uno muerde aquí. ¡Ra! ¿Dónde está? Aquí está, ven acá. Mira, aquí está el general Figueroa.
And I think a third scenario is where the U.S. doesn't strike land-based targets, continues its campaign at sea. Maduro stays in power despite the pressure campaign, and more or less the status quo that we're seeing now continues. And in that case, I imagine he'll make a play to consolidate his power and consolidate the power of Chavismo so that his rule is further entrenched as opposed to under threat as it is now.
Juro a nombre de la lealtad más absoluta al comandante Hugo Chávez que cumpliremos y haremos cumplir esta constitución bolivariana con la mano dura de un pueblo dispuesto a ser libre. ¡Que viva el comandante Chávez! ¡Que viva!
Imposición de la banda presidencial y el gran collar del Libertador al ciudadano Nicolás Maduro Moro